When you talk about addressing these core issues of inflation, is that policy side stuff? So we have fiscal causing inflation. Is fiscal really the only thing that can save us from inflation in terms of policy?
So I think there are a couple major factors. I think fiscal is a big part of it. It's hard to have inflation sustainably under 2% if fiscal deficits are 5, 6, 7, 8, 9% of GDP. It's basically you have to shrink the private sector by a significant amount, or you have to have absolutely massive productivity gains somewhere, so that the growth in the money supply has got a bigger than normal gap between CPI changes, like you see, for example, in the 1990s, like you see, certain periods. The other side is energy security. So right now, Europe has some of the worst inflation problems in the developed world. And it's in large part because their energy side was worse than what the United States went through. They have less energy security. And the ripple effects from that period are still hitting them, even though they've warm winter and other factors have largely stabilized it for now. And so I think the other factor is making, countries can make sure that they have energy security, it is in some ways a fiscal decision, but it's a productive fiscal decision. It's basically saying, okay, what can we do to either get out of the way of energy production or encourage energy production, so that, in the subsequent years, we don't have another spike like that. Mm-hmm. And one of the risks is that here in the United States, so natural gas, unlike oil, is not very fungible in the sense that transportation costs are a big piece of natural gas, whereas oil is relatively easy to bring around. And so when European gas spiked and also Japanese gas spiked, we didn't see a similar magnitude in the United States, because you can't just buy U.S. gas and immediately put it over in Europe. There's a limited amount of LNG export capacity. But over the coming years, they're building more and more of that. And so over time, you should, in theory, see a narrowing of that differential, which should be decent for Europe, but then could raise average U.S. natural gas prices, which is obviously good for producers, but not necessarily great for American consumers. And so I think over time, whether or not you're in the United States, whether or not you're in Europe or elsewhere, the various components of the energy supply side are similarly important to getting fiscal stabilized.
Do you think that's the primary thing to go after, is energy supply, in order to make sure that inflation doesn't tick back up? Because energy is the common denominator, right? Or is there other policy solutions that you see playing out?
I think that's the main one. I mean, mostly, so the state of just ever-growing technology gives us a kind of a background disinflationary pressure. And so right now, AI and other productivity tools are a disinflationary force, as well as along with the recession. And so the main thing is we have to ask ourselves, what could cause prices to go up on average? And so one is either unusually large money supply growth, like we saw in 2020 and 2021. And it's probably not going to come from excessive bank lending. So the main culprit potentially to look out for is ongoing fiscal-driven inflation. And the challenge there is that if you raise rates, even though that slows down the private sector, that actually increases the fiscal budget deficit, because you're over 100% debt to GDP. So if you raise rates significantly, that's actually more money flowing into the economy, ironically. So that's the one big side. And then the other side is just the core things. It's not just energy, it's also copper. It's various commodities that could end up being a bottleneck in the years and decade ahead.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about money creation? Because a lot of investors don't really understand it. You'll see a lot of M2 charts just floating around Twitter. So could you explain these sources of money supply, where they come from and how they impact economic levels and growth?
Sure. And to do that, we can separate broad money from base money. So base money is like wholesale money. In the old days, that would be basically the gold supply. In the modern time, that's basically the central bank balance sheet. Their liability side is essentially the monetary base for the country that it has jurisdiction over. And banks, commercial banks, hold reserves, and people hold banknotes. That's the monetary base. But then they also lend money into the economy. And so when you have a deposit at a bank, you basically have a fractional claim to a piece of the monetary base. And that ratio can vary over time, right? So in, say, the 1970s, it was near its peak. So you had a lot of broad money relative to the base money. And that broad money is what we mostly consider money supply. Like when you have money in an account, when I have money in an account, that's part of the broad money supply. That's the money that we interact with and that we kind of look at and decide what we're going to spend or not spend on. And there's two primary ways that new money is created. One is when banks make loans, they can increase the money multiple in aggregate, and so they can loan more money into existence. It's kind of unintuitive because in order to make loans, banks have to collect deposits and have all these reasonable kind of capital requirements and things like that. But on the other hand, when they lend, they as an aggregate number of banks, they increase the overall amount of deposits in the system, and so that's one mechanism. So when you have either say above trend demographics, like say the 1970s, when the baby boomer generation was entering their home buying years, you have higher than average lending, and so you can get above target, the kind of lending driven inflation. The other main way that broad money supply can increase is if the federal government does some very massive stimulus program. It could be spending on a war and soldiers, and then putting them through college when they come back, like the GI Bill. Basically, all these kind of ways of getting money to the economy. Could be stimulus checks, could be child care tax credits, could be PPP loans and certain grants, could be corporate bailouts, all that kind of stuff. It could even be unfunded tax cuts. If you just give people a big tax cut, but you don't change spending, that's functionally similar to a spending increase. And so these deficits are ways to inject money into the economy, especially when it's accompanied by the central bank also doing quantitative easing to increase the monetary base by those bonds, and so that money's not being extracted from somewhere and put back in. It's instead being basically extracted from this new void of dollars and put in. And so the two main ways are either fiscal deficits that are pretty big, or if lending driven inflation is running above target. And in the 2020s, as well as say the 1940s, fiscal driven inflation was the primary means of money creation, whereas in most periods, lending driven inflation is the primary factor.
And in the period that we're in now, is lending driven inflation the primary factor?
No, so the 2020s are mostly fiscal driven inflation.
Yeah, okay.
Ever since the global financial crisis, lending has not been a particularly strong driver of inflation.
Yeah.
It's more been the deficit side. And in the 2010s, it was overall pretty muted because you had kind of moderate deficits, you had pretty low levels of bank lending inflation. But here in the 2020s, largely because of all the stimulus response, we've had higher than average money creation, of course, until very recently.
And the Fed, they recently paused their rate hikes, right, to try and figure out what's going on with inflation. They've hiked rates 10 consecutive times, and they seem really focused on using that as the primary tool. And so we talked about like some fiscal solutions, I think, but how should the Fed be combating inflation, or is this the primary way that they should be doing it, all things considered?
I think one of the challenges that is in some ways the Federal Reserve is almost like the fourth branch of government. It's a semi-political organization, and they have certain mandates, and it can be very politically hard to say we can't hit our mandates right now because there are things outside of our control. If there's a war and oil spikes at $2 a barrel, their inflation target's going to have a problem. If fiscal deficits are running, say, over 10% of GDP, which is not right now, but they were, it's kind of like saying this is just not our tools can't necessarily address that. But because confidence is a large part of the system, the Federal Reserve always essentially tries to say, okay, we're gonna use our tools. And the problem is that their tools are almost entirely designed around either trying to stimulate more bank lending or reducing bank lending. And the problem is if that's a smaller component of money creation than fiscal deficits, then their overall impact is muted. And then if you get to a severe enough spot, like let's say Japan, for example, they have over 250% debt to GDP, public debt to GDP, and bank lending is very sluggish there. Demographics are declining. There's not a lot of booming credit demand. And so if they raise rates, it would actually dramatically increase the budget deficit at a larger amount than it would affect bank lending. And so they could actually, it could be bad enough that increases in rates could be inflationary unintuitively. So when public debts are low and most money creation's from bank lending, rates do exactly what we think. We think that, as we raise rates, it'll slow down bank lending. That's normally how it works. If you get to a point where public debt is so high and demographics are sluggish enough, where most of the money creation is from fiscal deficits and public debt's high, then when you increase rates, in addition to not being very effective at slowing down inflation, there's a risk that actually increases inflation.